Hey, welcome back. So, last summer, my good friend Mike sent me a message asking me if I'd be interested in building a piece of furniture for his wife, my good friend Susan. He basically told me that she has an unusual amount of boots, or maybe not an unusual amount of boots for a Texan, and that he wanted a solution for storing those boots that was both functional and beautiful. He told me that he wanted to give Susan a piece of furniture for storing her boots as a Christmas present. And since he's a Southampton Saints fan, I knew he could use this win of giving a really great Christmas gift, so I very happily agreed to take on the challenge. And after a few weeks of back and forth discussions on ideas of design and function, we settled on a design and I got started. So we ended up settling on something in walnut, as far as wood choice, and I suggested adding brass accents, since brass and walnut together look great, in my opinion. So I started by ripping down the sides and top and bottom of the main cabinet out of walnut veneered plywood, sourced from my good friends at West Vice Hardwoods, of course. And I will be edge banding the plywood with some hefty walnut hardwood, so I needed to mill down the rough cut walnut. But first, I needed to perform some maintenance on my jointer since it was in pretty bad shape. But after a few minutes, I had it all cleaned up and dialed in, so I could get to milling the hardwood edge banding out of a large piece of 4/4 walnut. And this is also when I wish I had a larger jointer, but this smaller 6-inch one does the job really well. Even given its age, it's a great jointer. Once I had a good edge, I was able to rip the strips of edge banding down on the table saw. I didn't worry about planing or jointing the face of the wood since it will be trimmed with a flush trim router bit later on in the build process, and I decided on 1.5 inches for the edge banding as opposed to something like 1/4 inch, which is what you might typically see due to the fact that I plan on installing Soss hinges and I wanted something really beefy to be able to bite into as opposed to small strips of hardwood and then mostly plywood end grain, if that makes sense. You'll see later on in the video, I promise. And just look at the amount of tension that was in that wood as I cut it down into smaller strips. But don't worry, I have a plan to manage that when attaching it to the sides, top, bottom, and shelves. Then I started to mark and cut down the sides, top, and bottom to final length with the crosscut sled on the table saw. And I love the hold downs on the sled. That was such a great idea on my part. And right there, I started to pull back the sled before the blade stopped spinning, but then I stopped myself, and I'm glad I did. Not that the blade would have caused kickback or anything, but because it may have damaged my piece, and it really is just a good practice on larger pieces like that one. Then I cut the long strips of edge banding down to size as well. After the pieces were cut to final length, I laid them out on the assembly table to choose a good grain match between the hardwood and the plywood parts. Once I was happy with the layout, I could start attaching the hardwood edge banding to the pieces. And in so many YouTuber videos, you hear them say instead of a domino, you can use dowels or biscuits. Well, as someone who still doesn't have a domino yet, I will once again be using dowels like I did in the build video of that handy dandy assembly table. And all I did was end up searching for and then buying this self-centering dowel jig on Amazon. I'll leave an affiliate link down below since it really is a great little jig for the price. I really like it and it worked out great for me. So I measured in on each end of the pieces about 3 inches and then I made a mark about every 5 3/4 inches for the dowels. Now this was completely arbitrary and maybe a bit overkill on the amount of dowels I end up putting into the sides, but again, due to the tension in the strips of edge banding, the fact that I will be installing Soss hinges, and the doors on the cabinet will end up being a little on the heavier side, I wanted to ensure that there was sufficient holding power. And I do think I got it, for sure. And here you just see me extending the lines of where the dowels will be so that I can use them as reference points with the dowel jig in just a moment. So I chose to use 3/8 inch dowels. Again, I wanted something beefy and with solid holding power. So on the jig, I selected the hole I needed to drill, inserted the supplied guide collar bushing thingy, and then simply lined up the line on the jig with the line on the pieces and got to drilling. I used blue tape around the drill bit to maintain a consistent depth for the length of dowels I ended up using. And once I was finished drilling the holes in the sides, top and bottom, I turned my attention to the edge banding itself. And of course it was the same process: line up the jig, drill the hole. Once all the holes were drilled, I used my strategically placed air hose to clean the table off a bit so I could get started on the dry assembly. Then I remembered the jig only came with like 5 or so 3/8 inch dowels, and I was going to need a lot more. So I made one of many trips to one of the big box stores near the house to grab some 3/8 inch dowel rod. Yes, I know they sell cut down dowels in bags, but of course I couldn't find them in the store. And asking anyone for help at those stores is like asking your 15-year-old daughter to be on time for school. Impossible. Ask me how I know. So after the dowel rod was cut down into smaller pieces on the crosscut sled, I used the oscillating sander to round over the ends to allow them to be inserted into the holes a little bit easier. All right, settle down, Michael Scott. But I ended up with about 50 little dowels from these 2 pieces of dowel rod stock, which was plenty for what I needed. Then I could finally start the dry fit, and I always like to dry fit to make sure everything is lining up the way it should, so I don't end up having to find out it doesn't right in the middle of a glue up. Once I was happy with the dry fit, I started to glue everything together. And I decided to use blue tape on the plywood parts to mitigate any glue squeeze out cleanup, because I was really worried that having to sand any leftover glue away introduced the opportunity to burn through the paper thin walnut veneer on the plywood. And really the other option of using a chisel to chip it away introduced opportunity to gouge said paper thin veneer. But in the end, that blue tape worked perfectly. And I initially wrote the time of the glue up on the tape so I could know when it could be okay to come back and take everything out of clamps, but ultimately I ended up calling it a night, and the time trick was really just unnecessary. But still a good practice, so remember that one. You're welcome. And the next day I took everything out of clamps and set it to the side. On the long pieces of the cabinet, I used this sort of L fence on the table saw to flush trim the edge banding with the plywood. And yes, you could also do this with a flush trim bit and a router, but I hadn't received my bit from Bits and Bits yet, not sponsored, so the L fence was the best solution for me at the time. Once everything was trim flush, I gave it a good sanding up to 180 to prep for Rubio, which is the finish I plan to use. So since I used plywood for the carcass instead of glued up hardwood panels, I needed to miter the ends of the pieces to create the final cabinet box. So I set my blade to 45 on the table saw, checking to ensure it was at a perfect 45 of course, and then shifted my crosscut sled over one miter slot so I could use the 45 cutting section on the sled. So 2 types of cuts with the same crosscut sled. Pretty slick if you ask me. And I knew the long cut would be straight since I built the crosscut sled, and of course I'm a master craftsman without the ability to make mistakes. But I wanted to check it to make sure, just to feel like an everyman, if you will. And yeah, as expected, the cut was straight as an arrow, and the miter was spot on as well. Once all of the miters were cut, I laid the pieces on top of each other on the table to ensure that they were in fact the same length, which would ensure that they would result in a perfectly square rectangular box. Which is such a weird way to say that, square rectangle. But I think you know what I mean. But before I could assemble the final box/cabinet carcass, I wanted to route out the dados or grooves in the sides of the cabinet that will hold the shelves in place. And you might be asking yourself, why didn't he just flip that straight edge over and use the built-in clamp to lock it down? Well, because of course I thought of that first, but it doesn't work, so that's why. Instead, I used double-sided tape and clamps. I also made a test cut on a scrap piece to ensure I was cutting the grooves exactly halfway through the middle of the 3/4 inch plywood. Once everything was in place, clamped down, and I ensured it was all the right depth and square, I used my plunge router to take several shallow passes for each groove. And I just made sure to take my time here so I didn't screw anything up. And then I used a cutoff of one of the shelves to test the fit. And it was perfect, of course. After the side pieces were routed out for the shelves, I cleaned up my shop floor and moved all 4 sides of the cabinet to the floor for the glue up. Since it is essentially a really large picture frame, I'll say that a lot in this video by the way, I just used the blue tape method for the glue up. I enlisted the help of my daughter, who was shooting hoops in the driveway, to help me flip the pieces over once I added the tape to each joint. Being careful, of course, not to dent or scratch the pieces. Then I proceeded to add glue to each joint, then basically rolled the cabinet up on itself to close all of those joints. I checked for square and then set it aside to dry. And you can see that I added tape to both sides of the joint, inside and outside, to again help with glue squeeze out cleanup. While that was drying, I was able to focus on the shelves, which I had also added hardwood edge banding to earlier. And I did that with dowels in the same way as I had done on the side pieces, top and bottom of the cabinet. Then I slid them into each groove in the cabinet and ensured everything was straight, square, and once I was happy with that, I was able to flush trim the edge banding on each shelf. This time I was able to use my router and this 6-in-1 router base from 3x3 Customs and the Astra HP coated flush trim bit from Bits and Bits. Again, not sponsored by either yet. Before final assembly of the main carcass, I wanted to go ahead and add finish to the pieces, which in this case is Rubio in walnut. It is much easier to add the finish before assembly than it is to assemble and then try to get the finish into all of the little corners of the cabinet. And you can see that I also added tape to the ends of the shelves since they will be glued into the carcass and glue doesn't stick well to pieces already finished with a hard wax oil like Rubio. And applying Rubio is so stinking easy. You spread it on, you work it in with a white Scotch-Brite pad, and then wipe it off. Done. That's it. And I just made my way all the way around the entire inside of the cabinet carcass. I let it all dry for 24 hours, and I came back the next day and added a coat of Rubio's maintenance oil, using the same process as I did for the finish coat. This will add a little more sheen to the finish than the rather matte finish of a single coat of Rubio, and I really wanted that extra sheen for sure. Then the last step, which was filmed a little out of order, but included here for consistency's sake, I measured and cut down the walnut plywood that would become the back of the cabinet. And I ended up just gluing around the edges and screwing into the shelves the back of that cabinet, and then edging the back of the cabinet with small strips of walnut hardwood to cover up any sight of the plywood on both the sides, top, bottom, and back. I just forgot to film me attaching the back to the cabinet, so you'll have to trust me when I say I did it right. And I promise I did do it correctly. Then I flush trimmed those small strips on the back and the cabinet carcass was finished. And it looked like I was gouging into the cabinet itself there, but what was essentially happening was just a super thin coat of finish was being removed by the router bit. And I fixed that with more finish later on. Now that the main cabinet was completed, I was able to work on the base, and the base was cut from this larger 8/4 rough cut walnut. I milled it all down into final dimensions using the jointer, table saw, and planer, just like I did with the edge banding for the cabinet and the shelves. Before I started to assemble the base, I used this rather sketchy quote-unquote router table to add chamfers to all of my base pieces. And while it does look sketchy, I was comfortable with it, and I made sure to take my time, ensure I had a good grip on the pieces. But yeah, I desperately need a router table. And as you can see on one of those pieces, I had already figured out where I could place some dowel holes that I would use to assemble the base. I transferred those 2 initial holes to my other 3 legs so I could drill them out as well. Then used the self-centering doweling jig again to drill out all of those holes. And again, this thing, while much slower than a domino, worked really good. And it did the job I needed it to do, so I'm very happy with this purchase. Once all of the holes were drilled into the legs, I clamped each leg to the table and inserted these little centering dowel thingies, I'm not sure what you call them, and they would put an indent on the rail so I would know exactly where to drill the corresponding holes on the rail/aprons of the base, which is what I did next. Then once again I did a dry fit to ensure the dowels were drilled in the right places on both sides and that the pieces went together the way they were supposed to. Once together, the top of the rails /aprons should be even with the top of the legs, so there would be 0 gap between the base and the bottom of the cabinet. And like a champion, nailed it. Then I clamped the front and back of the base assembly to the bottom of the cabinet so I could take referential measurements for the sides of the base assembly. I just placed the uncut side on the cabinet and marked the cut lines with the help of a small square. Nailed it again. Then I just glued it all together. And yes, I also, off camera, went and drilled more dowel holes to attach the side aprons using the same process as I did to attach the front and back aprons. To attach the base to the cabinet, I used figure 8 fasteners. I used the portable drill guide from Rockler, also not sponsored yet, to help me drill the holes for the fasteners in the base. This drill guide was perfect for this application, as well as the design we settled on for the doors, which you'll see in a moment. The guide is super solid and I found it really easy to use. I really like the depth stop feature as well, which helped me drill the holes for the fasteners to the perfect depth. Then I pre-drilled the holes and attached the fasteners with 1-inch number 6 screws to the base, and I ended up using 5/8 inch number 6 screws to attach the base to the underside of the cabinet, since I was drilling into 3/4 inch plywood. Once all of the fasteners were attached, I placed the base on the bottom of the cabinet into its final position. I then used an awl to mark the screw holes for each fastener around the entire base, checking for any movement and making sure the base stayed exactly where I wanted it to stay as I fastened it down. And I did end up using a clamp in the middle of the base to hold it tight to the cabinet while I drove those screws in the middle. Now that the main cabinet was essentially complete, I could focus on building the doors. And this is where I went back and forth over the course of a couple of days and weeks to settle on a design. Since this is a cabinet that will house boots, I knew I needed some sort of ventilation system. Because as much as I love Susan, shoes or boots in the Texas heat need some room to breathe, if you will. And Mike and I settled on a design similar to the one that Bourbon Moth used in a footlocker he built on his channel, link in the description below. The problem was drilling holes into plywood would allow you to see the layers of the plywood, and nobody has time for that. So the other option was to build solid wood door panels, which was also a problem since I would have to make them pretty thick to try and counter any cupping that would just eventually happen anyway. So I thought of something that would allow me to use plywood as well as cover the layers of the plywood, which you'll see in a moment. First, I started by building the frame that will encase the plywood inner door, and again, I used solid walnut for the frame. I milled it down and used the dado blade on my table saw with this temporary fence to apply even downward pressure through the entire cut to cut the dados in the frame pieces. Then I used my picture framing jig to cut what was essentially a really big picture frame. And this all worked out beautifully. And you can see there that I probably need to perform some maintenance on my table saw as well, but that's for another video, maybe. And if you're interested in that video, let me know in the comments below, and if there's enough interest, I'll put one together. Anyway, using the frame jig, I got all of the frame pieces cut down to exact size. Once I was happy with the cuts, I used the blue tape method to once again put the really big picture frame together. Then I measured to ensure the length and the width was perfect, and of course they were, but to make extra certain, I clamped the frames to the cabinet to check the fit and the gap between the doors. And again, nailed it. Or, as my daughter would say, that fit is extra crispy. And using referential measurements again, I was able to determine the final size of the plywood inner door pieces from the size of the frames. I cut that down with my Craig AccuCut, not sponsored, and the table saw. And I was very happy when the pieces fit perfectly in the frames. But before I glued up the final door assembly, I wanted to finish them and then install the ventilation holes. So, I came back later that evening, yes, in my Buc-ee's pajama pants, to tape off the edges of the door that will need glue to attach them to the frame. Then I finished the doors with Rubio Monocoat and Walnut again, and the Rubio maintenance oil, just like I did for the cabinet. Then I took a scrap piece of plywood to make a drilling jig for the vent holes. And the spacing on these vent holes was completely arbitrary. I ended up using 1.5 inches on center for both the vertical and horizontal measurements. Then I marked the lines with my square and placed the little brass ferrules on top of the jig to make sure I liked the layout. And from there, I went ahead and drilled the holes in the pattern jig. And yes, those are just brass compression fitting ferrules used in pressurized airline applications. They were the perfect choice for the ventilation holes. I'll leave a link to the ones I bought from Amazon down below. So again, I used my portable drill guide from Rockler and the pattern jig to get each hole in the door started. The depth stop feature on the guide allowed me to just start the hole with the pattern and then place a scrap piece of wood underneath the door to finish drilling the hole all the way through. And as you can see, doing it this way left me with absolutely no tear out. Then I completed the tedious task of inserting each ferrule into each hole with Total Boat Fixo that I mixed up in a cup. And yes, the ferrules were slightly belled upward, but I did end up flattening all of them out by sandwiching them between some oak, hardwood, and banging the wood with a hammer, which worked out perfectly, and then I was able to finally glue up each door. Before final assembly, I needed to go ahead and route out all of the mortises for the Soss hinges. This was a pretty straightforward process using the Soss jig I bought on Amazon, yet another link I'll leave below, and this process went pretty smooth. By using careful measurements and by carefully following the installation instructions for spacing and recommendations for hinge count based on door weight. And after I routed out each mortise, I would install the hinge using a self-centering Vicks bit and the brass screws that came with the hinges. I did this to ensure the final fit was spot on, and then I would remove the hinges to help me lay out the doors. And then I followed the same process on the doors to route out the mortises in those. And by taking my time, the mortises on both the doors and the cabinet lined up perfectly. So in the end, I am super happy with how it all came together. I really like the final product and I love all the brass accents. Oh, and I completely forgot to record myself routing out the pockets for those brass handles, but those were also installed using some Total Boat Thixo and the supplied screws. At the end of the day, I think it turned out pretty nice, and better yet, Susan and Mike loved it. Mike was able to catch a quick clip of Susan seeing the cabinet for the first time.
Is that what it was spraying?
Oh, yeah. My boots. Oh, it's for my boots. Awesome, baby. That is so fun. Aww. Who built it?
Christopher
Snake and Shake. Garza.
Christopher Blake.
Shake and Bake. Oh my gosh, that is
And yes,
so
if you caught that, my
fun,
nickname
baby.
back from when I used to work with Susan was Shake and Bake. That explanation too is for another video. So thanks again to you, Mike, for trusting in me to build this piece. And once again, Merry Christmas, Susan. You're two of my favorite people, and I love you both. Oh, and go Toffees.